afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this month's Interior Museum's Lunchtime Lecture Series. I'm Diana Ziegler, the Director of the Interior Museum, and I am very pleased to be welcoming back Dr. Dan Piazza. He comes to us from the Smithsonian National Postal Museums, and he is the Chief Curator of Philatelic. He's been there since, in that role since July 2014. He's responsible for exhibitions, research, acquisitions related to the museum's 6 million postage stamps and related artifacts. I thought we had a hard time over here with 8,000 artifacts. I can't imagine that many millions.
Stamps are small.
Yes, your storage is. But documentation, man. So well done. Which form the largest philatelic collection in the world and the second largest collection at the Smithsonian Institution. His research interests include stamps and postal history from the U.S. from 1894 to 1978, and the stamps and postal history of the Italian peninsula, the history of philately, and modern postage stamp production. Piazza earned his master's in American history from Syracuse University, where he also taught history courses in the University College and was the Charles A. Dana Foundation Fellow in the university's library's rare book collection. He received his BA in history with a minor in political science from Wagner College. And he joined the National Postal Museum staff in February of 2007 as the inaugural Winton M. Blount Chair in Research. And he was appointed assistant curator shortly after, and then becoming the youngest person to hold a curatorial rank at the Philatelic Collection's history. He served as assistant curator from 2008 to 2011 and curator from 2011 to 2014 until becoming chief curator. Piazza lectures widely and gives media interviews about philately, and he is a member of numerous national and international philatelic societies and a frequent contributor to philatelic journals and collector periodicals. From 2010 to 2015, he served as president of NAPEX, one of the largest and most prestigious philatelic exhibitions in the United States. And Daniel comes to us today with his latest project, Trailblazing 100 Years of Our National Parks, which was done in part in celebration of the centennial, which closed this past August. And that exhibit is still on view until March of 2008. So hopefully this presentation will give you a taste of what you can see at the Smithsonian through March, and hopefully you'll go visit if you haven't already. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Piazza.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that kind introduction. And as Diana mentioned, I'm here really on the occasion of the new exhibition. It opened about 3 months ago at the National Postal Museum called Trailblazing, 100 Years of Our National Parks. And before I get into the content of my talk today, let me just get a little bit of shameless advertising and housekeeping out of the way. So I brought with me some of the gallery guides that we actually give out in the exhibition for the public. They're on the windowsill over there, so feel free to take one or a couple of them on your way out. They have a few little extended stories in there about different national parks on stamps, and also historic mail to and from places that are now national parks. But they also unfold into an exhibition poster, full-color poster, featuring the original stamp art from the Grand Canyon stamp in the 1999 Celebrate the Century series that was issued by the Postal Service. So feel free to take a few of those. And I also brought some vintage stamps. There's a tray there, and they're kind of circulating around the room. There are 6 trays filled with stamps that either celebrate the Park Service directly, or they picture people and places connected with Park Service history. So feel free, as I'm showing some slides and giving a talk, to create your own little stamp collection to take with you. We are at the tail end of a public program series that we've been putting on for the last few weeks at the National Postal Museum related to the exhibit. Unfortunately, it's mostly over, but there are 2 more programs left in the series that I wanted to let you know about. One is tomorrow night at I think 6:30 or 6:45. It's a program based on the history of the Women's Auxiliary Corps in World War II, specifically black female soldiers serving in the Women's Auxiliary Corps in World War II, and Mary McLeod Bethune, whose home is a National Historic Site here in Washington D.C., was instrumental in creating and publicizing, promoting the work of those units. And so we'll have that talk at the museum tomorrow night, and then next Wednesday is the last of a lunchtime lecture series. Actually, there's one this Wednesday going on right at the same time over at the Postal Museum. It started at 12, right? Yes, these are our lunchtime lectures are at 12 o'clock. I could have. And next Wednesday, the lecture is on the history of Pennsylvania Avenue, and so someone from Pennsylvania Avenue National Historic Site is coming to give that talk as well, and you'll see a slide or 2 about that in my program. Sure, yeah, sure.
I never knew Pennsylvania Avenue was a historic site, and when did that become an historic site, and I don't understand.
Oh, I don't know the year that it became a National Historic Site, but the rationale for it being a National Historic Site is parades and protests, and the added dimension that you'll find out in my talk today is also Pennsylvania Avenue's postal history is important too. But yeah, I don't know exactly when it became a National Historic Site, but it is. So we're able to get somebody to come over and give a lecture. And then on November 2nd, we're hosting a scholar from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who's going to talk about the Smithsonian Institution and the National Park Service, and kind of the long and complicated history between the two. And I don't know all of the details on that yet, but if you want more information once it's finalized, my card and the brochure for the program series are out on the table outside the door when you come in. So just drop me an email and I'll be happy to give you more information about that lecture when we know more about it. And then, as Diana said, the exhibition is open until March of 2018. And so if anybody would like to arrange tours for DOI staff or Park Service staff, I'd be happy to give tours for any groups that want to come over and see the exhibition. And I've also been very fortunate to be invited to give this talk at a number of national parks over the last year or so. I've given it at Olympic and Crater Lake and Mount Rainier and a few others. And so if there are any Park Service units or interior units that would like to have this talk and the stamps and the posters and so forth, I'd be happy to do that too. Just take my card and let me know. Okay. So, as was mentioned, I'm from the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. I'm the chief curator of Philatelic there. The National Postal Museum is one of 19 Smithsonian Institution museums and research centers. Most of them are in Washington, D.C., but not all. We are in the Old City Post Office building, which is next door to Union Station on Massachusetts Avenue, and we opened in that building in 1993. But the Postal Museum's collection, that very large collection that was mentioned in the introduction, is much older than the museum. The collection dates to 1886. As was mentioned, it is the largest philatelic collection in the world. There are about 6 million objects in the collection, and really our mission comes down to caring for this national collection and providing the public with access to it. And one of the ways that we provide access is by going out and giving talks like this, but then also in our galleries through exhibitions. That's a photograph of the Trailblazing exhibition. You see there's a large prepared slab of sequoia wood in the middle of the gallery, and on the opposite side of that sort of plinth there's a large similarly prepared piece of petrified wood on the other side. We were really fortunate in that about a dozen and a half or so National Park Service units were really generous in lending us material for this exhibition. So there's Much of it is material out of the museum's own collection, but we tried as much as possible to bring some of the park-like experience into the exhibit itself. We did that by borrowing some of these big sort of environmental pieces from parks around the country, as well as some pieces related to postal history, and also by having these large photo murals that you can sort of see on the wall all around the room. It's really, it was a bit of a challenge. You know, you always want to kind of recreate the atmosphere of whatever it is you're exploring in an exhibition, and to recreate the atmosphere of a national park on the busiest intersection in Washington, D.C. is a little bit of a challenge. So we tried to bring in some of the artifacts and pictures. You can still hear all the traffic and noise outside the window, but at least you get a little taste of the national park experience. Right, that's right, and there are a lot of urban parks as well. We're really fortunate in that one of the spaces we have in our building is the suite of rooms that were at one time the offices of the City Postmaster of Washington, D.C., and they remain in much their original condition as when our building was built in 1914. So we have a few cases in there where we explore the history of the Park Service, the origins of the parks, where it came from, the rise of tourism into the parks in the teens and the 20s. Before the 1920s, really, visiting the national parks was an activity for the wealthy and very adventurous, because you had to provide everything yourself and so forth. But with the rise of roads and the automobile, it became much more of a part of the middle-class American experience. So we tell some of that story. And then also some of the major changes that came to the parks during the New Deal. And then in this larger room, really, we just kind of in a thematic way, look at the different types of National Park Service units there are and explore stamps and pieces of mail related to them. So in some cases, these are pieces of mail. This is mail service that's current, modern day, in and out of the national parks. You'd be surprised how many, especially of the large western national parks, have fully staffed and operating postal services within the park. Some of them have post offices that are on a par with what you'd find in any city or village of 50, 60,000 people. They're pretty large and sophisticated operations. Some of them are very small contract postal units, only open for an hour or 2 hours a day. But both the tourists in the park who want to send and receive mail, they use those postal facilities, certainly. But one of the things we try to explore in this exhibit also is just how much the park staff who live in these places depend on these facilities. In many cases, I think of one like, think of Petrified Forest in Arizona, where the nearest town, Holbrook, is a good half hour, 45 minutes each way. If you were to have to go into town for every item that you needed, you'd very quickly be doing nothing else. And so they rely very heavily there, the staff who are stationed there, rely very heavily on a small contract postal unit that's only open 1 hour a day. But that's how they get prescriptions, entertainment. There's no broadband internet. You know, I talked to the postmaster at Petrified Forest and said, what's the number one, this was just last year, so what's the number one piece of mail that you see come through this post office? What do you handle the most of? And she didn't hesitate a minute. She said those red Netflix envelopes. And you know, it's funny because here back east we think of that was 7-8 years ago, right? We've all gone to broadband. But if you're stationed in a place like Grand Canyon or Petrified Forest or Guadalupe, you don't have access to broadband, and many of them are there with their families and their children who want to see cartoons and the latest movies, and you can't go 45 minutes each way into town to see a movie every time you want to do that. So they still rely, for example, for necessities of life on receiving them in the mail. So we tried to get a little bit beyond the tourist and aspect of the mail service in the parks, although we do some of that too, and explore how the park staff really rely on these post offices. Okay, just a few highlight pieces from the exhibit in the section called The Origins of the National Parks. Very few people realize that Ansel Adams was a stamp collector. As a child, his mother gave him his first stamp album, and the Adams family, about about 5 or 6 years ago now, donated his childhood stamp album with his autograph and his address at the time written on the inside flyleaf. They donated the collection to us, and this is actually the first time we're exhibiting it in the museum gallery. But Adams was a stamp collector until about the age of 16. And at the age of 16, he received a camera on a family trip to Yosemite National Park, and he gave up stamp collecting, presumably forever, which is too bad, because he really could have been somebody if he had stuck with stamps. And there's no way to prove it, but I like to think that the young Adams was influenced in many ways by the techniques of framing and composition that he encountered in his early childhood collecting stamps. And one of the reasons I say this is because we actually have the album open to this page, which has something very unusual for a boyhood stamp album. As a curator, you often get people who come by with these childhood stamp collections, and they want to know, is it valuable and so forth. And there are certain giveaways that something is a childhood stamp album. You look at some of these early stamp series, and at the bottom of this page we have what's known as the 1898 Trans-Mississippi Stamp Series. It was issued for a World's Fair in Omaha, Nebraska at that time, but or an exposition. I don't know if it was an official World's Fair. But it was the first time, really, that scenery of the American West had been pictured on U.S. postage stamps. And it was a series that went all the way up to a $2 stamp in 1898. That's a lot of money. And so most of the high values in this series, like the 50 cent, the dollar, or rather the dollar and the $2, are missing from boyhood stamp collections. But here they are in Ansel Adams' childhood stamp collection. And so I think something about this imagery of the West, and of course he was a son of the West from California, something about this series appealed to him and spoke to him. And I like to think, it makes me happy anyway to think, that some of these early images of the West he encountered on stamps influenced the vision that he portrayed through his photography. Near Grand Canyon National Park is the last surviving mule mail route in the United States. And this is an extraordinary ritual that is enacted every day, 6 days a week, all year round in Arizona. The mail for Supai, which is a native village at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, leaves every day from the small town of Peach Springs, Arizona, which is right on Route 66, a National Heritage Corridor. And it travels 60 or 70 so miles overland by truck from Peach Springs, Arizona to a hilltop, where it's then loaded onto mules, a mule train of anywhere from 6 to 8 to 12 mules, depending on how much mail there is that day, and sent down to this village at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It is probably the most remote village in the United States to receive any form of mail service, and the U.S. mail is basically the only way to get any kind of provisions, including medicine, food, small articles and appliances, prescriptions, all this sort of thing. It all has to go down by mail. And for this reason, the Peach Springs, Arizona Post Office is the only post office in the United States that is equipped with a walk-in freezer. And that's because a large portion of the food that goes down there is frozen. Frozen food, so it's not uncommon to go to Havasupai Hilltop on any given day and watch them load up the mules with the U.S. mail for the village of Supai, and see them loading crinkle-cut French fries and milk and bread and baby food and food for the senior citizen center in the village down there, food for the primary school down there, and it all goes by U.S. mail. No one knows exactly how long this has been going on. This photograph is probably from the early 30s, based on the style of vehicle and so forth. There are paintings that of the same scene that date back to 1890s, 1900, turn of the century. I have not yet been able to determine exactly when mule mail to the bottom of the Grand Canyon first started, but it seems like it was pretty early, and it still goes on today. That's a photo that I took in 2014 of the mule train going down, and actually every day there are two mule trains. In the morning, That day's mail goes down to the village of Supai, and in the afternoon, the previous day's mule train comes back up. So they actually go down and stay overnight. It takes about 3 hours to go down and about 5 hours to come back up. There are actually 2 mule mail routes. This one is just outside the actual national park, but this is the official mule mail route. This is actually a star route contract. Someone in Postal Service headquarters in L'Enfant Plaza owns this contract. This is a government contract to run the mule. It's the only way to get the mail down there. And the Postal Service, unlike lots of other delivery companies, right, has what's called the universal mandate. They have this responsibility to bring the mail everywhere in the country. Any place that people live have to bring the mail. Other delivery companies don't have that requirement, but the Postal Service does. And so sometimes they need very unusual methods to achieve getting the mail down there. There's an unofficial mule mail route inside the national park, too. The Phantom Ranch is also at the bottom of the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River. And the concessionaire who runs Phantom Ranch is Xanterra, the modern day, the heir of the Fred Harvey Company. And they run a mule mail to keep, they run a mule train to keep Phantom Ranch supplied with, because they serve meals and so forth down there, with food, and they bring visitors' luggage down by the mule train and so forth. And they will also, as a service to their customers, carry mail for them back and forth to the post office at the south rim of Grand Canyon. So that's not an official route. There's no postal contract for that. It's just a service that the Phantom Ranch operators provide for their guests. But this is a real mail contract. One theme of the exhibit is how stamps have been used to promote the national parks over the years. The first time the U.S. national parks appear on postage stamps is in 1934, which was celebrated as National Parks Year. And that was really the brainchild of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Secretary of the Interior Ickes, both of whom were stamp collectors, and came up with this idea to promote visitation to the parks by issuing stamps. There's an interesting little story about this, though. This was the first time the national parks appeared on U.S. stamps. The first instance I have found of a U.S. national park appearing on any stamp is actually 2 years earlier. It's 1932, and it's a stamp issued by the Philippines. And the Philippines, of course, at that time were a United States territory, and all of their postage stamps were engraved and printed here in Washington at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and sent out then to the islands where they were used for postage. And in 1932 came a request from the Postal Service in the Philippine Islands for a stamp showing a famous waterfall in the Philippines, whose name escapes me at the moment. But it's a tourist destination. I think it's in one of the southern Philippine islands, fairly remote, difficult to get to. And so when the request came into Washington, D.C. for such a stamp, they went looking in the usual places for reference photographs, Library of Congress and so forth. And when nobody could produce one, so nobody has seen these falls. They're very remote. We don't have a picture. Oh, well, use this instead. And what they sent over was a photograph of the Vernal Falls in Yosemite National Park. And so the Vernal Falls appeared on this Philippine postage stamp in 1932, masquerading as a Philippine waterfall. The even more remarkable aspect of the story is that, as far as I can tell, these stamps circulated in the Philippine Islands for more than 6 months before anybody noticed that they weren't the right waterfalls. These falls were apparently so remote at that time that even most Filipinos had never seen them and had no idea whether it was the right fall or not until somebody said, hey, that's not right. But not only stamps have been used to promote the parks, postmarks and cancellations have been used. This is what stamp collectors call a slogan cancel. It's from 1917, and it promotes the opening of Mount Rainier National Park on June 15th. Many of the parks were, and still are, seasonal, particularly at places like Mount Rainier where they get enormous amounts of snowfall. And so this was done to promote that the season was on and you could go and visit Mount Rainier, and there are lots of examples of these from national parks all over the country. This is from Petrified Forest National Park, 1969. And this is an aspect of what I was talking about earlier, people inside the park relying on the mail for the necessities of life. So this is someone, park employee, sending in their payment for a children's magazine subscription for one of their children. Petrified Forest, because it was and still is fairly remote, at one time had its own elementary school, and you'd have rangers living there with their families, and so they relied on magazine subscriptions like this to keep their children entertained, and now they rely on little red Netflix envelopes. In the late 1930s, it was becoming very popular to operate motorhomes, trailers inside the national parks, and from 1939 until the early 1950s, the latest example I've seen is about 1951 or 52. In order to operate a motor vehicle with a trailer attached in a number of different national parks, you had to pay a fee. And stamps were issued. Stamp collectors recognize stamps of two kinds. Postage stamps, which pay for the postage on mail, which is what most of us are familiar with, and then revenue stamps, which pay some kind of a tax or fee. And this type of a stamp is classified as a revenue stamp, and they were issued in 50-cent and $1 denominations. I've not been able to find any information on what the distinction was between the 50-cent and the 1-cent stamps, why some parks seem to have used these forms and stamps and others seem not to have used them. Even where these stamps were designed and printed, they don't look to me like Bureau of Engraving and Printing Products. They look like the government printing office, but it's hard for me to know. If anyone in the Interior Department or the National Park Service has any information on these trailer licenses. We know that they were issued in 1939 because that's when the stamps first appear, and that's the earliest date that we find on any of these licenses. But exactly how and where they were used remains a little bit of a mystery. They're quite rare, particularly still on license like this. Maybe fewer than a few 2 or 3 dozen examples are known to collectors to exist, and we have 2 in the museum collection, and they're in the exhibit. But certain things never change, right? Do not feed the bears. Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton. But the imagery on the stamp is wonderful too, redolent of all 1940s and 50s family vacations, woody station wagons and chrome Airstream trailers and so forth. So a question was asked earlier about Pennsylvania Avenue and how and when it became a National Historic Site. One of the main features of Pennsylvania Avenue, of course, is the old post office tower, which is the less said about that, the better. And it's a feature of Pennsylvania Avenue, built in 1899. And so, in addition to the avenue's history of parades and protests, it also has a long postal history. So the earliest train stations were actually up on the mall. They were not over where Union Station is. And in those days, most of the nation's mail traveled by train. And so building the main city post office near the train station was important. And then when Union Station opened in 1909, I think it was 1908 or 1909, and the railroad shifted away from the mall up to that part of town. That's why all of a sudden you have to build a new city post office up by the train station. It was very important that the post office be by the trains, so you could take the mail bags right off the trains, bring them into the post office, and then the city post office would do all the sorting for the branch post offices all over town. So in addition to the actual main city post office and postal headquarters being located on Pennsylvania Avenue, there was for a time what were known as collection and distribution wagons. These were horse-drawn wagons that made 6 trips a day up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, so that businesses, hotels, government offices located along Pennsylvania Avenue didn't have to dispatch people to the post office every time they wanted to send out mail. A horse-drawn wagon just went up and down the avenue picking up mail. You could deposit it right in the wagon and it would be brought back to the post office for sorting. And these mobile post offices, these collection and distribution wagons, used their own postmarks And you can see there on the top it says Collection and Distribution Wagon, Washington, D.C. And this is from, particular one happens to be from Wagon Number 1 from the Riggs Hotel, which is no longer there, but was a famous hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. Manzanar and Minidoka National Historic Sites both commemorate the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And one of the salient features of these of camp life in these internment camps was that they all featured post offices, staffed and operated by the internees themselves. And by design, these camps were again located in very remote and inaccessible places. And oftentimes people who knew each other, friends, acquaintances, relatives, were in different camps. And so the only way that they could really maintain communications with each other was to operate camp post offices and communicate through the mail. And so there are several examples of this, is actually a photograph of the post office inside one of the camps. You can see the signage is both in English and in Japanese. And we have several examples in the museum collection of mail to and from these internment camps. This one happens to be remarkable because it's actually from one internment camp, Manzanar, which is now a National Historic Site, to another, Hart Mountain in Wyoming. So there are several pieces of mail related to this feature.
That stamp upside down?
It is, yeah.
In protest?
I don't know. In protest or carelessness, or I have no idea. But it is the World War II victory stamp upside down. That is true. One of the newest Park Service sites is Manhattan Project National Historical Park, which includes part of Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico and part of Oak Ridge in Tennessee and another site, which has slipped my mind. In Washington State, yeah. And one of the features of Manhattan Project National Historical Park at Los Alamos National Laboratory is that, thousands of people were stationed there at the height of the Manhattan Project, but its location was top secret, and people couldn't give out where they were located or what they were doing or what their address was. And so an elaborate series of undercover addresses was come up with so that people could send and receive mail while outsiders so you write to me at this address, but the address you were given actually had no relationship to where the writer actually was. So these were mostly post office boxes at various post offices around the country. Some of them were close to Los Alamos, like this box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's probably the most well-known undercover address for Los Alamos National Laboratory. But there were others. Somebody had a sense of humor because one of the undercover addresses for the Manhattan Project was a post office box in Manhattan. And there were people for the Manhattan Project also working in Manhattan. But so this mail would be sent from and delivered to the post office, and then the post office would hand it off to the military, who were the only ones who knew where the mail was actually ending up. The post office didn't actually do the final delivery of these letters because even the post office wasn't allowed to know where these letters were going. So this is a letter addressed to someone stationed this would be at Los Alamos, the famous box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And one of the giveaways that this is not just an ordinary post office box somewhere is all the censorship markings. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, passed by base examiner, and then the tape that obscures the stamp and runs on the right-hand side of the envelope indicates that that letter has been opened and censored and resealed before delivery. And that was very common in World War II with foreign mail, but you almost never see it on domestic mail. Domestic mail wasn't censored. So the fact that this is, anytime you see a cover addressed to some address in the United States during World War II that's just been censored, you know that there's something is a little off, and in this case it's because it's to the undercover Los Alamos address. Incidentally, one of the best social history books about life at Los Alamos National Laboratory is, the title of it is something like Inside Box 1663. And there, people were stationed there for years. Children were born there at Los Alamos. And It had to be a secret even on their birth certificate where they were born, and so their birth location on their birth certificate is a post office box in Santa Fe. They're known as the Box 1663 babies, and a number of them are still around and so forth. So that piece is in the exhibit as well. So I guess I just gave away the answer. I went too fast on the slide. I was going to ask the trivia question: what national park unit has been featured on the most postage stamps? And the answer is Statue of Liberty National Monument. The first time it appeared on a postage stamp was in the series of 1922, that kind of little sort of drab-looking 15-cent gray stamp. By the way, they are floating around in those trays. You can find some of those. I think you can find some of these Peter Mac style ones at the lower right-hand corner. I think some of those are floating around in there too. But Statue of Liberty National Monument is the Park Service property featured on the most postage stamps. And at one time, I haven't been able to determine whether this is still going on, but at one time there was a mail service of sorts from Statue of Liberty that you could mail postcards in the gift shop. And they would just be sent ashore on the regular ferry that would take passengers back and forth from New York and New Jersey to the island. But they do appear in the 50s and 60s at least to have received a marking, a rubber stamp marking showing that they were mailed from the Statue of Liberty. I have seen some of those. Whether they still offer that or not, I don't know. But it was being offered at least until fairly recently. Fort McHenry National Monument and Shrine in Baltimore is often associated with its War of 1812 history and Francis Scott Key and the national anthem and so forth, but it was still a military installation well into World War I. And during World War I, it served as a military hospital. And as a military hospital, it was receiving some of the absolute worst cases that were coming back from the Western Front. This was the first war to see large-scale chemical warfare, trench warfare, and so forth. Taking several feet of ground would come at the cost of enormous casualties. And so Red Cross General Hospital No. 2 was set up at Fort McHenry, and at first it had a fairly small number of patients and nurses and doctors, and the mail carrier from Baltimore would just leave the mail at the gates of the hospital. But as the population of Fort McHenry swelled to 20,000 by the end of the war, it suddenly had its own fully staffed and operating post office on the base, and this is an example of a return address and the postmark from that station at Fort McHenry. World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument, which has which is known for the site of USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma. Both of those battleships had fully staffed and operating post offices on board them to serve the sailors. Most larger Navy vessels still have contract post offices on them. And this particular letter sent from J.D. Kelly on the Arizona in April of 1941, and he died in the attack at Pearl Harbor several months later. Through the national seashores, the National Park Service has acquired some very iconic lighthouses. You can see the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. In this stamp, by the way, this block of 4 is also traveling around in those bins of stamp. This piece here on the right is an extraordinary one. It's an actual letter in a bottle from 1806. And in the years leading up to the War of 1812, one of the main grievances between the United States and Great Britain was, of course, that Great Britain was stopping American ships on the high seas, taking sailors off of American vessels, claiming that they were runaways from the British Navy, and impressing them into service on Royal Navy vessels. And in the process, they were taking quite a number of people who were native-born Americans. And so this led to increasing tensions between the two countries that finally erupted into war. This letter is from one of those sailors who was taken off a ship that left New York in 1806, was stopped on the high seas by a British warship, and he says about 10 other Americans were taken off the American ship and pressed into service on the British ship. Finally, when they reached about what today would be the coast of Colombia in South America, they were able to get access to paper and pen and a bottle and write a letter and put it in a bottle and drop it over the side of the ship. Took a few months for the Gulf Stream current to carry this bottle all the way from Columbia to North Carolina, where it washed up at Cape Hatteras, and was found by a ship captain there who was about to leave on a coastwise voyage up to Baltimore. So he took the letter with him from Cape Hatteras up to Baltimore, handed it to the customs collector at Baltimore and said, I think you have a problem here. And the customs collector at Baltimore read the letter and saw that the American ship these sailors were taken from had left New York, heaved a sigh of relief and said, it's not my problem, it's New York's problem. And he sent the letter up to New York. And in the exhibit, we have both the original letter in the bottle and the covering letter from the customs collector in Baltimore, sending it up to New York and saying, you need to find out what happened to these guys. There are impressment records at National Archives, and one of my projects on the duration of this exhibit is to get over there and do the research and see if I can find out whether they ever got these guys back or not. And then I mentioned the lighthouses. The lighthouse series of stamps put out by the Postal Service since about 1986, I think. Mid-80s is when the first ones came out. There are now, I think, 35 or 40 stamps in that series. It's one of the most popular series they've ever issued. And we have, through the Postmaster General's collection at the museum, the original artwork for most of these stamps, and we have selections of that on display in the exhibit. And then I'll end with a few fun examples of tourist mail from the national parks. Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park was founded in 1916, the same year as the Park Service itself. And again, I don't know exactly when the practice stopped, but until sometime in the mid to late 1920s, it seems, you were able to actually walk out onto the lava, and the park would arrange tours and things going out onto the lava. The top forms a very hard crust fairly quickly, but underneath the lava is still molten and still running. And during this time period, apparently it was a very common practice for tourists to write their postcards and put them in their pockets and bring them out on these hikes out onto the lava and actually burn the postcard in the lava before they mailed it, to sort of prove that you had been there and walked out on the lava. And there are picture postcards. It's kind of art imitating life, right? There are postcards with pictures of tourists and their postcards out on the lava, burning them in the fissures in the lava. And so here's an example of one of those. This is from, I think this one is from 1912. Trying to remember. No, 1913. So even before it became a national park, this was a practice, and it continued after the park was established. And I'm always a little leery of these things because postcards from Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park are fairly common. So how do you know that this is really one that was somebody just take a common postcard and singe the edges a little bit and say, this is a burned tourist postcard from 1907. No. In this case, the writer specifically mentions in her message that I scorched my hands and feet as well as my postals. So that's in the exhibit. From Yellowstone National Park in the 30s comes this leather postcard. And until the 60s, it was fairly common to find postcards made out of wood, leather, even metal, all sorts of non-standard objects. It was also very common for little bags of photographs and little trinkets, dolls, moccasins, so forth, were sold in the parks. They'd have little tags attached to them where you'd write the address and put the stamp on the tag and mail them off. So these kind of three-dimensional souvenirs from the parks. Then in the early 1960s, the Postal Service was upgrading all of its machinery, automating a lot of things, and getting lasers and optical, a little early for lasers, but pioneering optical character recognition and cameras in the equipment, and all of this wood, metal sort of stuff going through the mail stream. They didn't want that anymore because it was a threat to the equipment. They kind of stopped that. So the heyday of these wooden, leather, metal postcards is about 1910 to about late 1950s. But they are back. And I have been surprised as I going through some of the national parks giving this talk over the last couple of years. I'm finding all sorts of wooden and other postcards being sold, and the Postal Service now issues a special stamp. You've probably maybe even have seen them. They tend to be the large square stamps. They tend to have butterflies on them. And they're called the non-machinable surcharge rate. And if you use that stamp, you can once again now send wooden and leather postcards and things through the mail. So have fun and give it a try. I think that's the last slide, yeah. So if you have any questions or comments, be glad to do those. Let's see what time. 45 minutes. Yes.
Well, reading your bio, I got so wrapped up in looking at stamps that I have a question that might.
Oh yeah, sure.
So, like with this exhibit, obviously you did a deep dive into the Park Service, and I guess I'm just curious about, for any given exhibit, there would be different topics, and what do you do to prepare for these topics? Like how much time, and what's your typical research?
Sure. It depends for different exhibits. A major one like this, is several years in preparation. Then we have some smaller exhibits that are just a few cases. I can do those in maybe 3 to 6 months. But generally, it starts with we have such a vast collection, 6 million items. Only the tiniest fraction of which is cataloged, and so it starts with, as deep dive is a good metaphor. It starts with going into our collection, figuring out what we have in our collection on a topic that would be worthy of the exhibit, and then we start looking to partners like different national parks in this case to plug some gaps in the story. You have a story, and the pieces suggest a story to you, and then there are certain things that are missing, and those are the things that you kind of target for loans and go out and start asking other museums and other collections, what do you have on this topic, and so forth. So like right now, for example, I'm planning in 2018, the play Hamilton is coming to Washington, D.C. And it's all the rage up in New York. I was up there this summer, and everybody has an Alexander Hamilton exhibit now. New York Historical Society and lots of other places. I said, gee, it'd be nice if the Postal Museum had an Alexander Hamilton exhibit while the play is in production here in Washington. So I've just started looking at that. But of course, before he appeared on stamps, he appeared on currency. And so the numismatics curators at American History are going to try and find me a few early numismatic pieces to put in the exhibit as well. And so you find what you have first, and then what holes are you missing that you need to fill in or plug, and then those become opportunities for partners for loans. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
A related question. I wondered if you know of any postage stamps that feature the WPA artwork.
No. The question was about whether any postage stamps feature WPA artwork for parks. No. There is, I think I'm right in saying that. Yeah. No. Well, I don't think were any of those photographers in the night? They weren't WPA photographers who took the photographs that the 34 series were based on. Or were they any kind of government? They were government employees, but they weren't New Deal type. It wasn't a New Deal type of situation. Not on any Park Service stamps. No. I think there is a stamp featuring a Dorothea Lange photograph, but it's not a park. It's not a park stamp. Yeah. Yes, Diana.
What about the Old Faithful? That matches the.
Yeah, the Old Faithful stamp from 1972. It's interesting. The parks have had. We were talking about this before the lecture. The parks have actually had 2 centennials, right? The first centennial celebration was back in 1972, and that was for the 100th anniversary of Yellowstone. And now we're having the centennial of the National Park Service. So the National Parks and the National Park Service actually have 2 different centennial dates. But yeah, that stamp, and it's floating around in those bins. The stamp from the first centennial in 1972 of Old Faithful. It's a big, oversized stamp. That's why it's hard to keep in those bins because people like it. It is very clearly inspired by that. By the poster, the federal poster project from the 1930s, the image of the Old Faithful. It's that as Doug Lean has pointed out to me on a couple of occasions, that very archetypal sort of the three-lobed fountain which comes from that 1930s. So certainly inspired by, but that was actually new artwork created for that stamp, because we have the original artwork in the collection. So someone was commissioned to do new artwork, but clearly he took inspiration from the 30s posters. Yeah. I'm sorry, sir, over here, you had a question. Yeah. Oh, just stamp shows and eBay and so forth. I mean, we have a small for programs like this. I have a small budget that I can buy things for giveaways and promotional things at talk. So this is stuff that was never a part of the collection or anything. It's just you can buy some of these things in bundles of 100, so forth, fairly cheaply on eBay. So every few months I stock up on a few of them, and then I go out and give talks. Yeah.
And why is there a different centennial for Yellowstone? Yosemite.
Well, because the idea of the national parks is much older than the Park Service. So the first national park was created was Yellowstone in 1872. There was no National Park Service.
Oh, it was for Yellowstone.
Yeah, Yellowstone in 1872. Yeah. So that was created long before the Park Service existed, and during those intervening
It's a state park.
years, I don't know, it might have been. The Army actually patrolled the parks, and that's one of the reasons that they're still called park rangers, and one of the reasons that it goes back to that Army heritage, and that they still wear the Army campaign hats from the 1890s. That's the U.S. Army campaign hat from around the time of the Spanish-American War, is the heritage of that sort of very distinctive part of the uniform. Yeah, yeah. And that you'll also find in those bins, you'll find some of the Buffalo Soldier stamps in there too, because a number of the Army units that were sent out there to chase out squatters and poachers and people living in the park so they couldn't establish, homestead land claim type things. A number of the units who were sent out to do that work were African American units of the Buffalo Soldiers. Yeah. Sent out from the Presidio in California and on 3-month tours to patrol the parks and so forth. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.